In a desert where nothing sails, little grows, and conflicts define borders, could an idea change the 21st century maritime map? A project so ambitious that it promises to transform rock and sand into the most strategic route on the planet. Imagine ships traveling between Europe and Asia without depending on Egypt's narrow corridor, using a more direct route. Imagine an alternative to the famous Suez Canal, capable of crossing the Negev desert, passing near the Gaza Strip, one of the most tense and militarized regions in the world. This project is known as the Ben-Gurion Canal, and more than just engineering, it represents strength, autonomy, and provocation. For Israel, it would be a chance to become a logistical and military power, independent from Egypt and rivaling its top economic asset. For Gaza, a new axis surrounded by military interests, but for the world, a route capable of distributing wealth, influence, and strategic control. But is that really possible? The Negev can be tamed, a canal can cross conflict zones. And what would happen to Suez and the balance of the Middle East? If this project came to life, the Ben-Gurion Canal is an entirely Israeli proposal, crossing the Negev desert, one of the most arid and militarized territories. The route would seek to connect the port of Ashkelon on the Mediterranean Sea to the city of Eilat on the Gulf of Aqaba, already in the Red Sea. In practice, it would be like digging an oceanic route, where today there are only hard rocks, military bases, and dry valleys scattered across the horizon. Estimates differ by study, but the canal would be between 250 and almost 300 kilometers long, potentially making it longer than the Suez Canal, which is 193 kilometers long. However, while the Suez crosses a relatively flat, sandy plain, the Ben-Gurion would cross much more severe obstacles: mountainous areas, rocky terrain, differences in altitude, and a complete lack of rivers. This would require the removal of hundreds of millions of tons of material, as well as complex pumping systems and locks to balance the level between the two seas. It would be more than a canal. Several studies consider the creation of a multimodal corridor with expanded ports, freight railways, duplicated highways, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, and industrial zones, turning the Negev into a new logistical, energy, and military hub. This would place the project next to Gaza and close to Egypt, areas where any territorial change has immediate geopolitical implications. In other words, it's not just about navigating between seas, but about shifting the axis of power that controls trade between Europe and Asia. And it's precisely this ambition that explains why Israel has been studying this canal for such a long time. The idea of an alternative maritime route between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea was not born solely out of Israeli ambition. It gained momentum from a global trauma: the excessive dependence on the Suez Canal, a narrow corridor vital for world trade, vulnerable to wars, political disputes, and sudden blockades. This vulnerability became evident in 1967 during the Six-Day War, when Egypt blocked Suez. The canal remained closed for 8 years, isolating ships, diverting entire routes, and costing billions to international trade. For Israel, the message was clear: if it wanted to survive economically and militarily, it could not depend on a route controlled by a hostile country. It is in this context that strategic studies for a land alternative emerge, initially restricted to military and diplomatic circles. Academic sources and declassified United States documents indicate that between the 1970s and 1980s, possible routes through the Negev desert were analyzed. In some experimental proposals, they even theoretically studied the use of underground explosions to speed up the excavations. When both the United States and the Soviet Union were testing civilian uses of this type of detonation. Over the years, the project was never officially launched, but it also never disappeared. It resurfaced in the 1990s after the Oslo Accords, when regional cooperation seemed possible. It was mentioned again in the 2000s with the rise of China and the competition for trade routes. and today it is discussed in defense, energy, and logistics forums. If it is ever built, the canal will not just be a project against Egypt. This move will ensure strategic autonomy to control their own commercial route and turn the desert into infrastructure for a military, economic, and political alternative. And this ambition raises an inevitable question. Is it possible to build an artificial ocean in the middle of the desert? To answer that, we need to understand what it would be like to dig the impossible. Today, when it comes to civil construction, there are few things, or almost nothing, that humans can't plan and accomplish. But imagine what it would be like to start a project not on the banks of a river or the sea, but in the silence of a rocky desert. No water to dig, no flat land to cut through hard rock, extreme heat, and military bases scattered on the horizon. It's in this setting that the Ben-Gurion Canal would have to be born, like a blue scar, forcefully open, crossing the Negev until it reaches the Red Sea. The proposals vary, but they all point to a route between 250 and almost 300 kilometers long, with an estimated width of 150 to 200 meters and a depth between 30 and 50 meters, enough to accommodate large ships, including vessels equivalent to the models that cross the Panama Canal. However, unlike the Suez, excavated in sandy and relatively flat terrain, the Ben-Gurion would cross low mountains, rocky valleys, and thick layers of basalt and limestone, requiring deep excavations, controlled explosions, and complex locks to equalize two seas with different stability levels. This means that it wouldn't be enough to just open a canal. It would be necessary to remove hundreds of millions of cubic meters of solid material, install continuous pumping systems, and monitor the route militarily, since parts of the route pass near the Gaza Strip and sensitive areas along the border with Egypt. Not by chance, during the Cold War, experimental studies emerged that considered the use of underground explosions for civilian purposes, a technology unimaginable today, highlighting the scale of the challenge. Opening the canal requires breaking through the desert, which comes at a cost. Unofficial estimates compared with equivalent economic projects place the project in the range of tens of thousands of $100 billion. It might exceed the cost of the Panama Canal expansion, which has already used over $15 billion. Some planners are considering a hybrid corridor with navigable sections and high-capacity freight railways. This solution would reduce costs, lower environmental risks, and still create an axis between two seas that is less ostentatious than a canal, but just as strategic. However, whether it's a full canal or a multimodal corridor, the project goes beyond water. Israel envisions an economic and military belt in the desert, industrial zones connected to ports, protected gas and oil pipelines, solar plants, desalination plants, and defense bases. This shows that it's not simply about digging a maritime corridor. When a project alters not just land, but also the economy and military logistics of a region, it shifts from engineering to geopolitics. And it's precisely at this point that Ben-Gurion presents himself as a rival to the giants. To understand how grand the Ben-Gurion Canal would be, it's necessary to compare it to other colossal projects already carried out by humans. And at this point, we enter a fascinating territory because Israel would literally be trying to replicate and perhaps surpass the greatest waterway engineering feats in history. Suez Canal, the direct neighbor and rival. The most immediate comparison is with the Suez Canal itself in Egypt, which was inaugurated in 1869 and recently modernized. The canal connects Europe and Asia, letting ships bypass the lengthy route around Africa. It is about 193.3 kilometers long and was mostly dug through sandy and flat terrain, allowing the passage of ships carrying more than 20,000 containers on board. The Suez Canal handles 12% of global maritime trade and is responsible for billions of dollars in revenue for Egypt every year. If the Ben-Gurion Canal were built, It would represent a direct alternative to the Suez, diverting part of the traffic and, most importantly, offering a safer route. In times of instability in the Sinai region, as seen during the Ever Given ship crisis, which paralyzed the canal for days in 2021, Panama Canal, the standard of modular engineering. The Panama Canal, in turn, is an example of engineering in mountainous and uneven terrain, very similar to the Negev desert, and it also presents challenges of altitude and solid rock. There, the solution was to use locks, real elevators for ships, as well as artificial lakes to maintain the water level and control the flow. With 82 kilometers in length, the Panamanian Canal took 10 years to build. It cost thousands of lives due to the tropical diseases of that time, and it was recently expanded to accommodate the Neo-Panamax ships, with dimensions similar to those planned for the Israeli Canal. That is, in technical terms, the Ben-Gurion is closer to Panama than to Suez, due to the geology and topography involved. But what sets the Ben-Gurion apart from all these cases is the geopolitical and military intention behind the project. While Suez and Panama were conceived as commercial routes, the Israeli Canal also has defense and deterrence motivations. It will allow, for example, Israeli Navy fleets to move quickly between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea without relying on neighboring countries. In addition, the canal could become a global hub for data and energy, with submarine cables, oil pipelines, and gas pipelines running under one side of the excavated bed, creating an underground technological axis just as important as the naval axis on the surface. All of this elevates the canal to a level never seen before, not just a transportation route, but a geopolitical and commercial backbone of the century. Thank you. In a world where sea routes decide the fate of nations, a simple line on the map can be worth more than armies. It was like that with Suez, when Egypt turned a stretch of sand into a global artery, and it was like that with Panama, when mountains gave way so that two oceans could meet. Now Israel is considering risking the desert with the same ambition, to open a passage for ships where nothing crosses, to build infrastructure where nothing flows, and to project power where today there is only silence. The Ben-Gurion, if it ever leaves the drawing board. It won't just be a shortcut between two seas, it will be proof that the desert can be shaped, that geography can be challenged, and that the world economy doesn't belong only to the powers that inherited good coastlines, but also to those who dared to create them. Israel is not just digging a possible canal, it's testing the limits of what it can control, transform, and export to the world. Because in the end, great works don't just move cargo, they move borders, levy power, and rewrite maps. And when a nation decides to carve a path to the sea in the middle of the desert, it's not looking for water, it's insisting on the future. Thank you for watching this video until the end. What do you think about this great canal? And also about Israel's strategic port? Is it a challenge to the geopolitics of the Suez Canal, or is it a viable alternative for the entire world economy? Leave your opinion here in the comments. I'll stop here for now. A big hug and see you in the next video.